Thanks to everybody for being here at the end of a long day. I'll try and keep you awake. The title of this talk really should be called School and Teacher Governance. So more broadly, I think measurement, management are key components of effectiveness and governance. What I'm going to do is basically spend about 5 minutes giving you a little bit more of a background, than just this topic, and that's because I just finished, this is a paper that's outside, I just finished a review paper based on 10 years of research, most of it by JPAL affiliates, on what we've learned in improving education quality in India in the past 10 years, and synthesizing a body of work from large sample research, including experimental work, and synthesizing what that means for policy. So, the facts as far as education are concerned are pretty straightforward, okay, which is that the enrollment figures are pleasing. We've got nice numbers that say that over 96% of kids are now in school, but the learning trajectories, learning levels are pretty sad, given that this is a reading conference. You can see that as per the Pratham numbers, over 60% of kids aged 6 to 14 don't read at the second grade level. So these are the facts. The other thing, of course, is this is expenditure, under SSA, and in fact, if you add the state's components, the expenditure is considerably larger, but learning trajectories are pretty much flat. Okay. Now, what we see here, this is based on the work in Andhra Pradesh that Venki joined with Venki. Venki's here, and there's folks from the Premji Foundation who've supported this work and implemented it over a long period of time. Where did Ajay go? I thought he was just here. But what you see here is that it's not just that learning levels are low, okay, which is what the Pratham data shows, but it's also that the learning trajectories are very flat. So here's a single digit addition question that's basically a first standard level question, and what you see is that if kids haven't learned this by second grade, you can spend another 3 years in school, and less than 50% of the children who haven't learned it after class 1 will learn it after another 3 years in school. Okay? And this in some sense connects back to what Abhijit was talking about this morning, really. It's about teaching at the correct level, because even when you're sitting in class, if the instruction is going at the pace of the textbook and you are not at that level, you can sit in the class and the material is basically going above your head. Okay? So some of this will review what we've seen earlier in the day, but it's a body of facts that contributes to this view. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to literally just spend one slide, summarizing a lot of the research on education inputs. And the reason I'm doing this is because the focus of education policy, pretty much has been, in terms of, if you look at the RTE really, even in the words of Jean Drèze, is a Right to Education Facilities Act, as he said, as opposed to right to education. And I want to summarize this to then motivate why we are focusing on the topics we're focusing on in today's session. Okay? So there's a full paper outside you can read in detail, but let me just quickly go through. If you look at the major categories of spending, right, the three main categories of spending in the budget are infrastructure, teachers, and student incentives. Okay, so they're spending on student books, notebooks, midday meals, stuff like that. Teachers about 45%, infrastructure is about 35%. Now, we don't have lots of randomized evaluations with infrastructure, but if you look at the aggregate trend, you could kind of see that this is perhaps by itself not contributing to learning. Now, what we now have is we had done this All India study back in 2003, nationally representative sample, 19 states, over 1,500 villages. That was the original teacher absenteeism study. Now, what we've done is we've gone back to the same villages 7 years later, basically between 2003 and 2010. So it's a panel data set of exactly the same places. And what you see is there's a substantial improvement in infrastructure. Right? So the good news is when the government of India decides to measure something and focus on it, it manages to do it. Okay, so on the infrastructure side, you see huge improvements. There's a doubling in schools with electricity, quadrupling in schools with midday meals, doubling in schools with toilets. So on all those infrastructure measures, there've been very significant progress. But this improvement in infrastructure is not correlated with any improvements in learning outcomes. Okay, so the question is, what is going on? And basically, there's three possible theories, one of which is just that infrastructure makes schools nicer, but what matters for learning is the teaching-learning process, okay? And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this might be the case. The infrastructure may not be getting used, so there's well-known stories of libraries that the teacher locks up, or toilets. In fact, in our AP data, we have matched data between the household and the schools, and what you see is that in 75% of the cases where the school has a toilet, the child is still going outside in the school. Now, this could be because there's no water, it could be because the teacher is locking up the toilet, but bottom line is it could be that the infrastructure is not getting used. And the final possibility, which we're very open to, is it is possible that with infrastructure you have to evaluate this over the depreciation life cycle of the investment, right? Because it's a capital good, it's possible that the aggregate impact over 30 years might be positive, but that the annual effect is too small, right, for you to measure. So we are not saying that infrastructure is not useful or not needed, but what the evidence points to is infrastructure by itself is not going to give you quality learning outcomes, okay? Now, the second major thing is teachers, and you can look at teachers both in terms of quantity, which is reducing PTR, and quality, which is in terms of training. And the evidence here is just stunning, right? There is not a single paper, not one paper, okay, that finds a positive correlation between teacher training, and student value added. So let me take a 1-minute methodological detour, right, into how this is being measured. So you don't measure things in terms of what are student test scores against teacher qualification. The way you measure this is you measure it with what's called teacher value added, because you're saying what was the level of learning the children had before they came to this teacher, and what did they leave with after 1 year, right? So you match the teacher to the student, and that gain in learning is what you're then attributing and calculating as teacher value add, okay? So again, what this literature is finding is that there's absolutely no correlation whatsoever between having a trained teacher, and learning outcomes. If anything, we're finding that the B.Ed teachers are doing worse than the diploma teachers, and that it might be slightly negative in terms of primary school. Now, the evidence on PTR is also mixed. There is some evidence that reducing PTR helps, okay? But 2 or 3 studies don't find an effect, a couple of studies do, and regardless, it is a very, very cost ineffective way of getting learning outcomes, because it's by far the most expensive component of the budget. And in fact, so what could be going on? The mechanism, the first possibility is just that it's not saying that training cannot be useful, but training as it is currently done is basically, it's the content of the training is completely meaningless. And I've spent a year in the faculty at an education school. I used to teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for a year. And most of what happens in education schools is focus on history and philosophy and theory of education, including there's a lot of sociological aspects of education, but very little focus on classroom management, very little focus on actual pedagogy or instruction. So some of this could be just reflecting the content of the training. But the other part is the fact that it's just the utilization, because whatever you do in terms of training is not translating into how the teacher is changing practices in the classroom. And then finally, going back to some of the themes that Abhijit and Rukmini talked about earlier, even the training is not really accounting for the reality of the multi-grade classrooms, the reality of the variations in levels of learning. So this is not to say that you should not be thinking about training, but at least training in a business as usual way, as it has been done, if essentially we are saying that we need trained teachers to improve quality of education, if that trained teacher doesn't mean anything more than somebody with a training stamp as it currently stands, that by itself is not going to make a difference, okay? Now, with PTR, we see some very interesting evidence in our panel data, right? So what you see is that schools where the PTR has gone down, there is a significant increase in teacher absence rates, okay? So what is happening is that the teachers are substituting effort, like when you get more teachers, it's like, hey, great, I can take some more time off, okay? So, and this is documented in study after study. We've done this randomized evaluation where we gave these schools an extra teacher, and what you see is that the absence rates of the other teachers goes up, okay, when you get this extra teacher. So again, this is not to suggest that the net effect cannot be positive, but that's a mechanism for why the effect might not be translating into outcomes. And then the final thing is in terms of student inputs, okay, you can think about unconditional grants and midday meals. So there is some evidence that these kind of programs, particularly midday meals, improve enrollment. So there is evidence to say that enrollment goes up in response to midday meals, but again, we are not finding any effects on test scores. And if anything, there are correlations that suggest that there might be some negative effects on learning outcomes. And the possible mechanism here, again, is teacher time substitution, right? Because we have detailed data on teacher time use diaries, and you're seeing that over 10% of the school day of the teacher is reported managing the midday meal process, and in some cases that's higher. So again, this is not to say you should not do midday meals, but there is a cost. There is a very real cost in terms of teacher time and substitution, and all these programs by themselves. And so similarly, we've got this very nice randomized evaluation in Andhra Pradesh, where 100 schools were randomly selected and provided with school grants. So we gave 10,000 rupees per school, and the schools are allowed to buy books, notebooks, workbooks, a whole bunch of things, okay? And what you see is in the first year of the program, there's a significant increase in test scores, but in the second year of the program, the effect goes to 0, okay? There's no effect. You've given the money again, okay? There's one more round of money. But what is happening is that in the second year, the households have reduced their own spending. okay, because we're also tracking household spending very carefully. So what happens is in the first year, the program is unanticipated, so the households have not yet adjusted their own behavior, and so there's a total increase in the resources, and you see this increase. But with the matched data, I mean, you see, and I see Mr. Adu nodding because this is exactly what we're talking about. When the government does a bunch of things, the community, in some sense, might be stepping back its own responsibility, and in this case, these are households. So this is again just suggesting, okay, this is not, I'm not going to put this up and say that inputs don't matter. But I think the evidence is very clear that inputs on their own are probably unlikely, to make a big difference. On the other hand, interventions that focus on pedagogy and interventions that focus on governance have both been found to be highly effective and with very large effects from relatively simple interventions. And that's why we're focusing today's session fundamentally on the themes that have been found to be effective. So we started off with pedagogy in terms of learning. We're ending with governance, and technology kind of straddles the two because technology can both be used to improve pedagogy as well as to improve governance. Okay, so that's kind of how the program is set up. So I'm just doing that to motivate for those of you who are kind of have at the back of your mind, why are they not talking about schools, why are they not talking about facilities or teachers or training? It's mainly kind of responding to the fact that what we find to be effective in the careful work in the past 10 years mostly seems to fall under these two buckets of interventions, things that either look at pedagogy or things that look at governance. Okay. So you've heard about pedagogy in the morning and technology, so I'm now going to pivot and talk mainly about governance. So in terms of governance, I think the most basic measure of this is just teacher absence, and this is numbers we have back from 2003, about 25% absent on any given day, and about half the teachers not actively teaching. And this is by far the biggest component, right? It's 90% of non-capital spending is salaries. So if you're looking at which is the highest marginal component of the education budget to improve, it is teacher effectiveness, because that's the biggest component of your budget. Okay. Now we've gone back and done an all-India panel. We do find a reduction in absence, so that's the good news. Okay. The good news is it's gone. The rural absence fell down from about 26.3 to 23.7, and in fact many states have gone down, but UP has gone up quite a bit. So in a weighted average national population, weighted average national means, so Bihar has improved a lot. There's a lot of improvements, but the UP has gotten much worse, and so that's kind of making the national improvement look less good than it would otherwise be. So we know, for example, that we see in the data that teachers who are more absent are less likely to have the contract renewed. Okay? So there is a direct incentive effect in terms of contract renewal. There's also closer ties to the community, and there's also just lesser of a social distance, because most of the regular teachers in our sample live about 12 to 15 kilometers away in the district headquarters. Their kids are in private school and they're traveling so the social distance is much further for the regular civil service teacher compared to the contract teacher. So these are possible hypotheses, but overall, across a set of studies, you find that these contract teachers appear to be at least as effective. So what I'm going to spend a fair bit of time talking today, and because we're talking about performance measurement and management, is really this larger issue of performance-linked pay for teachers. Now, I'll be the first person to say that this is not something that is currently implementable. Okay? I don't think we have anything close to the infrastructure required to implement. But I think the larger point we're making here is that if you look at a teacher's life today, there is nothing in a teacher's life, professional life, that depends on what they do. Okay? And if you look at our absence, so I'll come back and tell you much more about that paper. Okay? But a fundamental determinant of school performance is the effectiveness of teachers. Now you can improve this by hiring higher quality teachers, and you can improve it by increasing the effort of existing teachers. Okay? So these are both dimensions on which you can improve teacher quality. And there's strong evidence to support the effectiveness of even small amounts of performance pay. So this is a paper I'll talk about a fair bit based on extensive and careful experimental work in Andhra Pradesh. You've all heard about the paper that Esther and Rima did with cameras in classrooms. Now again, the point is not to say we want to put a camera in every classroom. The point is that a little bit of monitoring and rewards tied to attendance. So over there, you were paid for every day you showed up. You don't show up, you don't get paid. Simple. That's all, right? Nothing rocket. It's not rocket science. It's like you show up, you get paid. And that led to a halving of teacher absence. And then we've got this follow-up work on the Andhra Pradesh experiment, which is now the longest running experiment in the world, that has done a compensation experiment in any sector. Right? So for 5 years, these teachers in Andhra Pradesh were paid on the basis of average improvements in student test scores, right? I mean on the value add. So these are very small bonuses, okay? They're still getting their base pay. The average bonus is only about 3% of annual pay. So the average bonus is about 3,000 to 5,000 rupees a year, but it is tied to performance, okay? And what you see at the end of 5 years are massive improvements, okay? So the students, because what's nice about 5 years is this is your complete primary school. So we have a cohort who's completed their entire life in primary school, I mean under this regime. And the effect in maths is about 0.55 standard deviations, and language is about 0.35. So 0.55, those are huge effects. That's like 20 percentile points at the median of a normal distribution. Right? These are big numbers, okay? And in terms of implementation principles, one thing that we've learned from a bunch of other studies is that impersonal performance pay that is implemented on objective measures of performance tend to be much more effective than programs that are implemented that are intermediated through a human being, okay? Okay, so one of the things you worry about, and this is a big thing in the performance and organizations literature, okay, is that if you provide some kind of bonuses on some measures of output, do you get negative outcomes on other dimensions, right? I mean on things that are not measured. So it's what's called the multitasking problem. And so we take that seriously to see, is this program simply reading to cramming and kind of more rote learning, or are you genuinely improving learning outcomes? Okay, you can compare group versus individual incentive schemes. You look at how teacher behavior changes, so it's not just a black box of saying here's a program, here's an effect. You really want to understand the mechanism of how things change. You want to think about the cost effectiveness, you want to think about variation and responsiveness across teachers. Okay, so let me just spend a few minutes talking about potential concerns with performance pay and how we address this. Okay, so the first concern is that sometimes people worry that teaching is a profession that people come to with intrinsic motivation, okay? So are you cheapening the idea of teaching, right? I mean by providing something like a performance bonus. And I think if you read the psychology literature in this, it's quite subtle, right? I mean, it's not as simple as saying do external incentives crowd out internal incentives. It's a question of how do you implement this. So if the program is seen as exercising command and control over a domain of professional expertise, then it is demotivating. But if it is seen as being aligned with professional norms, then in fact it increases motivation. And the best example is faculty, right? Like, you know, so if some administrator sitting in Sacramento is micromanaging faculty on teach this or don't include this textbook or take this out or this cartoon is bad, that is very, very demotivating to faculty because it is micromanaging in a domain of expertise. But at the same time, if there is no recognition or differentiation based on your research output or your productivity, then that's also demotivating because then you have a bunch of deadwood who are not doing anything, okay? So what you want is you want the incentives to be aligned with norms of good professional behavior, and then that crowds in intrinsic motivation, okay? So the key recognition here is the framing of the program. So if you frame this as a program on school accountability, then you've lost half the battle, right? Because then it's an adversarial framing with respect to teachers. And this is the problem in the US where a lot of the rhetoric around No Child Left Behind has been about school accountability, right? I mean, whereas if the framing is around recognition and reward of outstanding teaching, in fact, you find that most of the teachers support the program, right? So I'll tell you more about the political economy, but the teachers love the program, okay? Teaching to the test is much less of a concern given how low the levels of learning are, and what I'm going to show you is we designed the tests, and Sridhar's not here, I mean we designed the test to have what we call both components of mechanical and conceptual learning, right? So if all you were getting was cramming, then you would see improvements in questions that look like the textbook, but you would not see improvements in questions that change the format, okay? So we've got questions that are also measuring conceptual learning. And then one thing which is really nice, and particularly in the context of this program on reading, is the bonuses are based on gains in maths and language, but we also do a surprise test on science and social studies, okay? Like I mean which they're not expecting, and you can test whether the reading spills over onto the other subjects or whether there's a crowd, okay? And then there's issues about technical details about getting the formula right, okay? And so this is, I'll skip this, but again there's a lot of thinking that needs to go into getting the formula right, because if you say we'll reward you on your pass percentage, okay, then the teacher is not going to spend any time on the very strong kids because they're going to pass anyway, and I'm not going to spend any time on weak kids because they're going to fail anyway, okay? So, and then you focus on kids in the bubble. So what you do is you calculate for every kid based on their learning level. You calculate a child-specific target, and then you basically base the bonus as a function of how the teachers outperform the child-specific target, okay? So it's all thought about extremely carefully, okay? And I'll talk more about this later. And you know, cheating now, of course, in this case, the Azim Premji Foundation ran the program, okay? Like I mean, I think you weren't here when I called out APS, but they ran the program, and so it was the integrity of the program was assured. But the other important point is the bonuses are actually very small. Okay, these are not big bonuses. See, if you make it a very big bonus, then you kind of change the calculation with respect to teaching, but it's not worth losing your self-respect for 3%, right? Like, I mean, and so if it's 300%, I mean, you might go and do something crazy. But the entire point here is to have a very small bonus that shows that the system recognizes and rewards, right? Like, I mean, some measure of teaching. In fact, I was telling this to Mitch and Madhumita last night, is that there's a principle in human resources that says praise without money is crass, but money money without praise is crass, but praise without money is cheap, right? Like, so you need a little bit of both to get effective performance. So you want the recognition and you want a little bit of the bonus, okay? So let me just kind of quickly get to the results. And I mean, the reason I'm spending time here is just to emphasize, whether it is technology, whether it is performance measurement, there is no substitute for careful thinking. Right? Like, I mean, and that's why I'm going into these details. You can't just say, here is a program that is going to have effect. You've got to get into the mechanics of how it's going to affect behavior, and then think through program design in a way that those kind of pathologies or bad things that could happen are anticipated and accounted for. Okay? So let me go through the results reasonably quickly. Okay? So what you see here is very significant improvements in the schools that had the bonuses. And the most important result is that you find these gains in every subgroup of the population. Okay, it's in every district, in every grade, at every level of question difficulty. So, I think Mitch will take away my coffee, but the statistical term here is that the performance-based schools first order stochastically dominate, right, in the control. So it just means that everybody was better off, okay? So nobody was worse off as a result of the program, and there were sustained gains across the distribution, okay? Getting into some of these issues I talked about, you see that there are gains in both the mechanical and the conceptual questions. You see significant gains in science and social studies. And in fact, in the paper, we talk about the technical decomposition of this. And you'll be very happy to know that the mechanism for this is the better performance on reading. Okay? So if you look at the improved reading and put that in as a predictor in science and social studies, you'll see that the dummy on the treatment goes away. So it's coming from the better reading is where the better performance in science and social studies is coming from. So, which kind of makes sense to, it's just obvious, but kind of reinforces the importance of early reading. Okay? Individual versus group, it turns out that they're both equally effective in the first year, but after some time, the individual starts doing much better than the group, and we can talk about that later. Now this is very interesting, okay, in terms of mechanism. So the one bad news is, in spite of this performance-based incentive, teacher absence did not change. Okay? So the absence rate remained at 25%, okay, as measured by our independent audits. But what you find is that when you talk to the teachers, they report basically doing just basics, more homework, more classwork, some extra classes, and some practice tests, okay? So it's not rocket science, but they're just working a little bit harder, like along the lines that they know how to do. And even the small amount of hard work is having such a huge effect on test scores. And it's just highlighting the fact that in a business as usual setting, there's just no reason, I mean, for a teacher over time to stay motivated and work hard, except for their own innate goodness. This is not to say that there aren't good teachers, but like, you know, over a time you can beat out virtue out of like even the most virtuous teacher by having nothing in the system that recognizes that virtue. Okay? This is a very, very important point, okay, and comes back to this issue of training. Okay? Now what you see is that in the typical school, the training makes no difference. Okay? But in the incentive schools, teachers with training respond significantly better. Okay? So what that tells you is that training gives you the capacity to be a better teacher, but in the business as usual setting, you don't use that capacity because there's no reason to use it. But when I'm giving you a reason to use your capacities, the trained teacher does better, okay? So the simple mathematical way of thinking about this is the following. Suppose quality equals knowledge multiplied by effort, okay? So it depends on what I know, and it depends on how hard I work, okay? So if I increase effort, the quality is going to increase more when the knowledge is higher, right? So the partial derivative of quality with respect to effort is going to be knowledge, correct? So when knowledge is higher, the increase to effort is going to show up more. So the point is to think about performance measurement and management as a force multiplier for all the other inputs you have in the system. You see, it's not acting in isolation, but it gets all your other inputs used more effectively because now you have a reason to do that. Okay? So let me quickly then, on the political economy, there's one very important point here, okay, which is the teachers had, and 85% of them had a favorable opinion, and about 67% said the government should consider scaling this up. But there is one important caveat, okay, and this is important both for the Premji Foundation and for the government, which is they say that they trust the program as long as it's implemented by the foundation. Okay. But that if the government were to implement it, they worry that the politics would take over, okay, and that this might not be implementable with the integrity that we had in the project. But this is an important point even for USAID and others, because it suggests that there might be a long-term role for a non-profit, right? I mean, so the normal model of a non-profit is that you go do something and you hand it over for scale up, okay? But if you think about the organizational comparative advantages, right? Government has certain advantages, non-profits have certain advantages, for-profits have certain. And there's a very nice theoretical paper by Tim Besley and Maitreesh Ghatak that show where the non-profits dominate, right? So where the non-profits dominate is in their ability to attract motivated employees, right? I mean, who are motivated by the sector, but who cannot be guaranteed that they will be able to work effectively in that sector in the government, right? Because in the government, there are too many other compulsions. So you're able to attract high quality human capital into the non-profit sector, but that is working not for profit, but is working for a social cause. So it suggests that there might be a particular niche here, like I mean for long-term involvement of non-profits with commitment that can demonstrate and implement some of these things that might be hard for government to credibly scale up, okay? So let me kind of stop there and then talk. I have about 10 minutes. 10. Okay, so I'm going to go through this reasonably quickly and not spend too much time on them. These are policy recommendations I made in the context of the 12th plan, like I mean not all of which will apply here, but I think the first point is just very, very simple, okay, which is make learning outcomes a central goal of education policy. I mean, and after everything we've seen, it should be obvious, right? It should be completely obvious, but with due respect to MHRD, there is a 0% weightage on learning outcomes, right, in the results framework document of HRD. Now, HRD values all the right things, right? There is access, there is equity, there is quality, and then there is governance, right? So all the right bullet points are there. But quality has been completely defined in terms of training and has been completely defined in terms of inputs. So the point here is not to say that these things don't matter, but the system has to care about the outcomes, okay? So now let's walk through very quickly some of the common stated reasons for not doing this, okay? So the most common reason you hear is, oh, this is stressful for children and education needs to be joyful, okay? Then there is a worry that there is too much testing in India anyway, right? I mean, and that we need less testing and not more. That's the three idiots criticism, okay? And then you've got this notion that government cannot be held responsible for outcomes, that government can only be held responsible for what we can provide as inputs, and these all sound reasonable. But there are straightforward responses to all of this, okay? And the first is, I think, and this is very much in the spirit of CCE already, okay? So this is not in fact contravening that, because the spirit of CCE is exactly that you do assessment, not assessment of learning, but assessment for learning, right? Where assessment of learning is with the view to classifying and saying, ye buddhu hai, ye smart hai, right? And that is stressful and you don't want that. But what you want is you want the assessment as a way of providing real-time feedback to teachers, saying my kids have not understood and I need to do something different, right? So that's the point in which the assessment for learning becomes essential. The other business about too much testing. So frankly, this is a case where I believe it's kind of the interest of the top 2% determining policy for the full country. So it's certainly the case that the urban elite kid is over-tested and over-pressurized, like I mean, and so it seems natural to say get rid of the 10th standard exam, but that's because the elite have other ways of signaling, like I mean their capacities through other expensive signaling devices, whereas for the vast majority of people, without that testing, I mean, you don't in fact have a credible signal that you've learned anything. And there's a lot of research that shows that at low levels of learning, testing in fact helps learning, that it's not something that is contra learning, because it's the process of taking a test that makes you put together what you've seen. So there's a lot of research that backs that up, okay? And then basically, I mean, I was just going to say, like, you know, the spirit of RTE is completely violated, like, I mean, if you don't think about this in terms of learning outcomes. I mean, what does it mean to be educated if you can't read, right? So it should just be so obvious that I don't think, at least at this point, after 7 years of Pratham data that shows this flatlining of test scores, that we shouldn't at least put learning outcomes as a fundamental objective of what the 12th plan needs to be, okay? Then, I mean, Abhijit has talked a lot about this, so I'm going to skip this, okay? But I think this is a critical point, that the curriculum right now, like I mean, is going at a pace that is way above, like I mean, where most of the kids are, because the curriculum was written by the elite at a time when education was not a mass enterprise, and when the historical purpose of the education system was not to teach things to everybody, but to identify who the smart people were and move them into positions of leadership, right? So the miracle of the IIT is not what the IIT teaches you, it is the integrity of the entrance exam. So then you take the top 0.01% of a billion% distribution and they'll do great things regardless of what you do in the IIT, okay? So the point is that if you're trying to provide mass education, the syllabus and curriculum and classroom practices and pedagogy have to account for where the children are and cannot be in denial that if you just go through the textbook, portion khatam kar diya, bacche ne seekh liya, right? I mean, that's just not what's going on. So I'm going to, and then I think this is one of those things that's just also ethically, like, I mean, it's so obvious that if you care about inclusive education and if you have children starting at very different points, you want to use step one to identify who needs the help, and the point here is you want to provide those additional resources. Like, I mean, and if you care about inclusion, then you want to care about inclusion with the perspective of getting to learning outcomes. Now, the third point is kind of more controversial, okay, but I'm just going to leave it up there and just kind of say that the facts don't support the view that contract teachers are not effective. Now, I understand this is politically a hot potato and I'm not going to push it, but let me at least suggest that if you accept that you want to provide massive additional resources to children who are falling behind, is where do you find the money, okay? So one way to think about this is at least to use contract teachers more aggressively for targeted remedial instruction, and then find a way of integrating them over time, like, I mean, into a mainstream with a little bit of training. So we can talk more about this, okay? So there's a bunch of objections to use of contract teachers, and all of these can be addressed by thinking about teachers in terms of a long-term career ladder, okay? So then you have a tenure track model as opposed to a permanent adjunct faculty model, right? Like, I mean, so everybody joins without tenure, like, I mean, you're evaluated over a period of time, you get trained, and then over a period, this is Gujarat, I think, had something like this, and I think Maharashtra has also done things like this, so it's not feasible, but it's something that I think part of the problem is we're not willing to consider cost effectiveness explicitly as part of our policy objectives, whereas the real comparison is not one contract teacher versus one regular teacher, but many contract teachers versus one regular teacher. The final point, sorry, I'll just take a few more minutes, on governance, okay? And this is, I think, this is way beyond what we are capable of doing in India right now, so I'm not going to push this as a policy recommendation. But there's some really important research on this from the US that I want to highlight, okay? So first is that teacher quality really, really matters, okay? So having a sequence of 3 good teachers as opposed to 3 bad teachers, where a good teacher is not defined by your qualification. A good teacher is defined by somebody who statistically is identified as being effective at improving learning outcomes, okay? So if I have 3 good teachers in a row, that can circumvent a very large part of the initial learning gaps, okay? So the good news for policymakers is that teachers make a difference. The bad news is I cannot tell who is a good teacher by looking at your CV. Okay? So you might have education X, training X, qualifications X, that doesn't tell me whether you're going to be a good teacher. Okay? So what do? You want to think about measures of management that are based directly on measuring productivity. Okay? So the study I want to point to, which is just an absolutely landmark study, is, so one thing you might say is, okay, this guy is talking about this statistical value add. You know, what's the point of all of this? Okay, now Prajit mentioned this too, that right now we're looking at test scores, but what we really care about is long-term life outcomes. Okay, so there's this absolutely gorgeous paper, which I think to an academic gives you goosebumps. Okay, like, I mean, but basically what they've managed to do is they've managed to track children over 30 years, right? Like, I mean, from the teachers you had in school all the way to your tax records, right? Like, I mean, to look at the impact of the teacher quality you've had in school to your long-term life outcomes. Okay, and what they find is that having a high value add teacher between class 3 and 8 is significantly positively related to long-term outcomes like wages, employment, college attendance, social outcomes. So it's all there, okay? So it's not just test scores, but it is there in the long-term outcomes. Now, we don't have data in India to allow us to do anything like this. But again, with our 5 years of data in Andhra Pradesh, we're able to look at the distribution of teacher value add, and you see, if anything, that distribution is even bigger in India. So the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher is even more important in India than in the US. And it's very obvious why that's the case, because in a case where the parents are illiterate, the teacher is a much larger determinant of your learning outcomes. So the spread, the variance in outcomes between a good and a bad teacher is much larger in India, right, than what you have in the US. And so what that highlights is that improving teacher quality is absolutely critical, but the observable measures are not doing this, okay? So the career ladder helps on both the selection margin and on the effort margin, right? Because what you want is you want to select high quality teachers and you want to induce continuous motivation and continuous effort, okay? So what this proposal does is it reduces the entry barriers to joining teaching, which our friends in Teach for India do, but it raises the barriers to staying in teaching, right? Like, you know, because if you're not effective, you don't get to stay. So if the training is not such a good indicator of your effectiveness in teaching, then that becomes an inefficient barrier to entry relative to who might be effective. But at the same time, what you have in your existing pool of teachers is they pass some degree at some point, but are in fact completely ineffective and are stuck in your schooling system for 30 years. So what this approach does is it allows more people to come in, but increases the standards for what it takes to stay on. Okay? So we can talk more about this later, but I think the long-term returns to getting this right are enormous. Okay? So I don't think we're anywhere close to being able to implement this, and I'd love to see this implemented at the level of one block, right, or one district. I mean, the last thing I'm going to say is go scale this up, but that's what it is. So let me just do 2 slides and move into implementation. And I think from the plan perspective, because this is a document targeted at the 12th plan, I think the most important message here is to provide states and districts with much more space for innovation. Okay? And that's basically because implementation is a tactical issue. Implementation has to account for local variation. Conditions in Kerala are not the same as Bengal or not the same as Gujarat. Whereas, unfortunately, our approach with centrally sponsored schemes is exactly the opposite, right? I mean, which is to put states more in a straitjacket and say, you do this, you do this, you do this. Whereas what you really want to be doing is using states as laboratories for innovation. So I see Surina ji is here. You know, Haryana has been very proactive. Gulzar has been very proactive. So there will be variations in who is proactive in what sector, and you want as many of these experiments going on across states. And so you get 28 settings for experimentations of ideas, and Indian states are huge. The top 10 states would be in the top 25 countries in the world. Okay? So they have enough scale to do almost any of these innovations. And what's interesting, this is what I said, because different political leaders and officers have priorities, different things will get tried. And finally, the locus of political accountability in India is increasingly moving to the states, because national elections are kind of an agglomeration of state patterns, and so it's very difficult for political leaders at the national level to be held accountable, whereas at the state level there's much more accountability, and so there's a lot more desire to copy good ideas. Okay? And you see this happening, I mean, across a range of things. And so the main recommendation for the 12th plan, and this feeds into how I think USAID is also thinking about this, is really to move from a structure of mandating and policing to a structure of learning and sharing, right? Because it's the states that are running education systems, let them experiment and let the center facilitate learning and sharing of best practices, and so it just turns around this idea of Delhi knows best. Okay? And so the summary of the implementation roadmap is that business as usual is not working, that inputs might be necessary but not sufficient, and it's unlikely to work without parallel work in reforming governance and pedagogy. Do the easy things first. So a lot of the things I've mentioned are not immediately doable, but this is an increasing order of practicality. But there's no reason to not put outcomes at the center of what we do in the 12th plan. Let's just start with that. And I think the Indian state has over time shown capacity to deliver on things that get measured. Okay? So once you measure the right things, you will unleash a bunch of forces that lets creative people at the district and block levels think about ways of doing this. You want to encourage these experiments, and these are the action items for the 12th plan. So I have a last slide on just the implications for the USAID, and I think this particular theme, and I wasn't here in the morning with Bill, but he mentioned this last night, is that the entire focus of what USAID is trying to do is, in fact, I think exactly in lines. So I didn't engineer this way, I engineered it this way. I wrote this paper 2 weeks ago, and it turns out that this is exactly what you're trying to do, which is really facilitate innovation. Right? Like, I mean, have highly leveraged impact of a relatively small amount of funds. So, 10, 12 million is kind of a rounding error in an SSA budget, but it's huge when it comes to being able to foster innovation. And that's because the structure of government procurement makes it much harder to innovate with government money. Okay? So what I'm going to do is just, so the core competitive advantage then would be, support innovative ideas, evaluate shared results, and support scale-ups, and specific areas to encourage along the themes of this session would be high quality independent measurement and reporting of learning outcomes. Okay? So what are ways of doing this in a scalable, low cost way using technology, right? We know this needs to happen, and this is something where a lot more innovation is needed, and whether it's nonprofits or private players, these are dimensions in which people should be submitting proposals to USAID, I hope, and saying here are ways we can do this, help us develop this. Crowdsourcing, perhaps using mobile technology data on daily school performance. So I've already seen cases where you can give school committees cell phones, and somebody in the school committee in the PTA goes to the school every day and reports 8 key indicators, right? Like, I mean, is the teacher here, is the midday meal here in place? And so that way you get community involvement, but that data is going straight to a backend, it's getting aggregated, it's reported and sent right back. So these are interesting ways in which, because when you think about governance, the most important thing you need is accurate real-time data, right, from the field in terms of how things are working. So that would be an area for innovation. I think supporting development of state and district level leadership capacity, this is what I think the Premji Foundation is trying to do, but particularly in using data for better management. supporting third parties to develop capacity to implement some of these things. And I think one thing that shows up with the concept of incentives is I think it's very useful to study interventions with and without improved incentives for teachers, right? I mean, because the business as usual is always, here's a supply-sided intervention, and I think what the evidence suggests is adding just a little bit, of teacher incentives on top of input-based interventions can have a very large effect, okay? And like I said, it's especially valuable, and I think this is a great time to transition to Gulzar, because he's been somebody who's tried to implement a bunch of things, and what you'll see is that government procurement and audit rules can make it very difficult for innovators within government who are trying to do something new, but there is no precedent for that kind of spending, and so that might be a particularly leveraged place for this type of effort to kick in. So let me stop there.